Hey, everybody. Welcome to Reigniting Small Business, the podcast. I'm Laura Richards, and I'm here with Patrick Lee of Spark Business Institute today. How you doing, Patrick?
Doing well. How are you, Laura?
I am also doing well. So today we're going to be talking about infrastructure, basically how to design and implement the infrastructure you need to catalyze growth in your small business. Um, and when we talk about infrastructure, Patrick, what exactly are we referring to?
So let's put some definitions out there because I do think that it gets a little bit confusing for folks, and a lot of times people jump almost, at least in today's environment, they jump to IT infrastructure, right? That's where their minds go. But let's talk about public infrastructure. So companies like Amazon, Walmart, the big boys, right? They're taking advantage of public infrastructure. They use the highway system, they use train tracks, they use airports, right? They use big industrial, designed developments, right? So they're working at that scale, right? But then they also have their own, they have their stores, right? When we're talking small business, we're usually not talking public infrastructure, though small business takes advantage of that, right? We are using the roads, we do ship things. But we're talking about our brick and mortar generally, and we're also talking about our technology, and we're talking about our personnel too. I mean, infrastructure is pretty much all the things you put together that allow you to deliver that business.
Got it. So getting it right is pretty important to being able to grow as a small business.
It is, and there's a series of challenges to that, I think. Right now we have an interesting thing going on, right? Because we've got folks who have discovered that the brick and mortar they thought they needed, maybe they don't need, right? So when we're talking about infrastructure, we're not necessarily talking about adding infrastructure. We're talking about getting the infrastructure right. Okay, so is there money to be saved by not having an office and folks working remotely? And if you're doing that, what sort of infrastructure needs do you now have in IT to make sure that that actually works? And does that also change the makeup of your personnel in certain ways as to who works well remotely, who doesn't? How do you manage that? So these decisions aren't just, do we need more office space in another truck or another piece of equipment, but how do we configure all of this to get our optimal production?
Right. And that's all, everything you just said is about being proactive, right? So, do you recommend that people, if they have an infrastructure plan of some sort to begin with, that they look at it periodically, and how often should that be? And is it possible to have a roadmap for growth that actually
There is, and I think that it's interesting you bring up infrastructure plan. I think at Spark we actually in one of our assessments when we're talking to folks, we ask them, do you have a business plan? Do you have a strategic plan? Do you have a marketing plan? Do you have an infrastructure plan? Do you have an HR plan? All these plans, and we all know that, and we ask them written down, not do you just have a plan in your head? And those who have a written down plan usually have maybe one or two, right? They have their sort of basic pro forma business plan, and then they might have a marketing plan or an operational plan. I mean, they may have another plan, but the idea that they would have a plan for all these areas, including infrastructure, they would look at you and they go, "What do you mean?" Right? And I think that's sort of telling that we're not as proactive as we could be, because we tend to think in sort of vague visionary things. I want to grow my business. I want to become the number one in my area. We're a small business, so we're thinking local. We're thinking, I've got two competitors. I want to be the biggest one of those competitors. And the specifics around each of the pieces of that plan are happen more because of happenstance, right? We're reactionary to it. It's not happening because we sat down and said, okay, to reach this level, we're going to do this. To reach this level, we would need these things. It happens as we go. And that tends to limit us a little bit. It tends to have us not seeing things far enough out and maybe allocating resources in ways that could have been optimized better had we had that plan.
So, and just hearing you say that, I'm seeing that there are little landmines out there, or major pitfalls that can happen with this kind of on the fly infrastructure build. And I'd like you to tell us about one.
I have a good story here of a client that I worked for, and this particular client will remain nameless, but they had a patented product, and this patented product, it was in the construction industry, and it was being built. It was being made by outside folks. So there were the folks who actually made it. Then it was sent off to a place to be stored. And from that place, all the logistics would happen. It would get shipped, fulfillment of orders, all that. That was all subbed out. And this was hugely profitable because the home office for this company was simply the staff to handle all of the back office stuff, but none of the production, shipping, any of that. Hugely profitable, really well done. The owner of that company recognized that he was a one product company making a lot of money, had his impact, but if he wanted to remain impactful in the industry long term, he was going to have more than one product. I mean, that patent's going to run out at some point. There's going to be some other product that comes up to compete with it. So what are we going to do? So he had invented the current product in his basement. So he went down in his basement and he invented another product. He got patented and everything and brought it back out. And to his credit, he got a patent. It worked. The product worked. But he had in his mind that even though it was a very profitable business model, he kept looking at the fact that he was having to pay other folks to build this, ship it, do all that. And he kept thinking, there's a markup on that. So if I own the infrastructure, the means of production, it's going to benefit me. So he invested in the means of production, and he had a huge facility, big pieces of machinery, personnel, all of that. And he released this product and it flopped. And long story short on that is the market he thought existed for this product turned out not to exist. So my very first thing that I was handed to figure out coming back in was, what do we do with this? And so we did a bunch of research. Long story short, we did find a market for this product, and we started selling it and putting it out there. But that market was probably about an eighth the size of the market he had envisioned. So now we have a bunch of infrastructure that at the time in his mind was going to make him money, and now was more of an inefficiency that we were working around. So, that's a cautionary tale.
It sure is. Well, so how can infrastructure planning be used as a tool for creating capacity and momentum? What's the flip side?
Well, the flip side to that is looking forward in a way that enables you to implement as you hit benchmarks. Okay, I mean, and that's how we tend to do most of our planning and our tracking in small business, but we tend to do it specifically related to finances, right? Our budget, our revenue projections, and our cost projections. And we don't necessarily back into the details of what does that actually look like, right? So to become efficient in that way, I think what you're doing is you're saying, okay, let's stop for a second. We just put in our cost piece here, a new machine. And that new machine meant that we were going to do additional revenue. That's why we're doing it. And we knew we were going to hire one other person. But let's actually look at this all the way through, right? Does that machine produce scrap? Who's cleaning up that scrap? Where's that scrap being stored, right? How's it getting shipped out, right? How do we get rid of that? What about storage? If we're doubling the amount of units we're producing, where does that go? And does the fulfillment center have the ability to handle that? And should there be more than one? And so when you start tracking this versus simply reacting when it happens, like we have no more space, what do we do? Let's contact the landlord and see if we can have the space next door. Well, is that the best, square foot cost per square foot space, or are you just, we got to get something in there now? So planning is the answer to all of this, but planning at a detailed, specific level.
And I would actually say, emphasize the ongoing point. Having been a franchise operator, I got a system, right? And it was pretty well thought out in terms of the infrastructure needed to open a standard unit. But because of the environment we're in, our unit wasn't standard. So, the average unit was doing 5% catering. We were doing 17% catering. Our needs dramatically changed. Delivery vehicle, having hot boxes, having ways to keep food hot in the car. Do we want to use personal vehicles versus having a vehicle for the store, and on and on and on. So that became something, it kind of grew over time, but that you had to address with a completely new infrastructure as though it were an ancillary business.
And I think it's interesting too, because I think you probably demonstrated the accidental planning, right? The first time you got the extra catering job, you put it in your coolers or whatever, you hopped into your car and you drove there and handed it to them. The seventh time you did that in a single day, you're going, okay, do I need something better than a cooler? Why am I using my car? And so you'll upgrade from there. But, we all know, had we thought about where we were going to be, not just what we needed now, we might plan for that. And I have another story related to that. Around one of the businesses, I was co-founder of a veterinary blood bank, and we were part of a veterinary center. They have dentists, they have surgeons, they have internists, they have all the specialties in this center, and we were part of it. And at the time, we were under an umbrella of an emergency clinic that sort of was the facility manager, and then we were all in there, and we were in about 3,800 square feet. And we were telling the folks who were sort of the facilities managers, we need more space. All of us are looking at this and we're feeling like more space is absolutely necessary. And they're like, well, I don't know why, you're not turning anybody away. We're doing fine. And it's kind of hard to see because, that whole capacity piece ends up happening because, you're making decisions knowing what your limitations are, but not necessarily being super aware of it. So you would have things like, a large dog might present, the vet would look at it and the vet would go, okay, this might be one I would typically bring in house and observe. But I know I don't have a lot of space, so I'm going to send them home, tell the owners what to look for. And if a problem happens, they can bring them back in. Right. So you're not even necessarily consciously aware that the space is what is impacting things. So long story short, over time, we convinced them that we actually need to grow. And so they go, okay, let's do this. And so they buy a piece of property and they design a 10,500 square foot building. They get it built. We all move in. And when we get there and have moved in, we've outgrown it. And that shows you that planning piece, right? Because that was a reactionary thing. It was too small of a space. Right now, we're in 3,800 square feet, and we could use about 10,500 square feet, right? But that's planning for right now. It took about 3 years for that building to get built. And at the end of the 3 years, all those businesses have progressed. And we weren't even looking out beyond those 3 years. So what happens in the 5 years after that? So long story short, we moved into a 10,500 square foot building, and we had immediately outgrown it. It was already too small. We probably needed 18,000 square feet. So this story goes even further now, because that building was built only about a little more than 20 years ago, and about 23 years ago. And about 2 years ago, they knocked that building down, bought a piece of property behind it, built a much larger facility, and made the initial place a parking lot because they didn't have enough parking even at that time. So, think about this. A 10,500 state-of-the-art building got knocked down in 20 years because of a lack of planning.
That is really telling. Somebody needed to be working on that infrastructure plan way before they started to dig that first building.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we're seeing two really big trends coming out of the pandemic with infrastructure, and we've touched on both of them a little bit. First of all, is technology, how people are utilizing it both for working remotely, as well as businesses that maybe didn't even rely on technology so much, like mom and pop or more, smaller restaurants and smaller retail businesses who, through new technology, is now able to do so. And the second is personnel, which we've talked about as well. So let's talk a little bit about how those two aspects of infrastructure are really coming into play right now.
Well, I think the first thing we need to do is we need to talk about capacity again, because the idea that all of our businesses are limited by our capacity, and we were talking about this earlier, how capacity actually fits in every inhibitor, right? You could have capacity limitations based on your leadership team. You can have capacity limitations based on your infrastructure, your IT, your personnel, etc. And until you address those capacity inhibitors, you really can't grow or do anything. And what we've seen with the pandemic and this whole remote work piece is a shifting of infrastructure. So do you as a small business need an office space, right? Or not? And if you're not going to invest in office space, if you're going to run it from home, do you need IT infrastructure and technology brought in? And so I think what we're seeing is this. We're seeing options that were never thought to be available in the heads of small business owners are starting to pop into their heads. And they're now looking at this much more from an efficiency and optimization standpoint than they ever did before, right? Like, wait a minute, where's the return on investment? What's the best model for what I do, for how I manage, for what my clients expect? And options are being presented, okay? And I think that when we look at technology especially, there is a no going back thing now. There was a whole lot of people, technology was moving along and we knew that, but there was a whole lot of people who were slow to implement, and it was just a gradual thing. And this pandemic flipped the switch. Those who were quick and able and nimble to do it went somewhere, and those who weren't began to phase out. So now all of a sudden we've got all the adopters are in place, ready to go. And so technology infrastructure is rapidly becoming key beyond almost anything. And the choices you're making as to profitability and business model revolve around that technology. So I think what we're seeing here is what was already a focus has become the focus. And then you go, okay, the focus, but all I read about in the news right now is personnel issues. You say, well, yeah, okay. The focus moving forward, our issue right now is personnel.
But those two things intersect too. Before we leave talking about that, the technology has enabled personnel to obviously to have more quality of life, and companies who have embraced it and are giving employees the freedom to decide when they come into the office, for example, and how they use the technology, are able to retain their personnel much better than companies who are not. So I think that's also very interesting.
But it's not just retain, it's also attract. What you're seeing is once folks got a taste of not having to commute to work in this space for this amount of time, and then commute home, like all of a sudden they're like, I don't like doing that. I like this other model. And so that's why a lot of these industries, when we're looking at where the industries are that the personnel issues are occurring right now, a lot of them are brick and mortar. We need our personnel in here. They actually work in here doing things. The whole restaurant industry, hospitality industry, retail, we need those people here. And a whole lot of people are going, I don't want to be there. And that's not the only issue, obviously, but that the adaptations necessary to make that work, it revolves around technology, and also revolves around leadership being able to get a little bit more creative. Like, okay, maybe I can't expect my wait staff to work an 8 to 10 hour shift 4 days in a row, because they're not going to stick around. Maybe I got to get creative with how I do this, and I'm not suggesting what that is, but without that creativity, without recognizing what has just transpired, your ability to attract and retain is very difficult. And you're left doing it by paying way higher wage rates than you ever expected to.
I totally agree. And I do think we're seeing people do creative things, shortening their business day. A lot of restaurants have tightened their hours up, not having those hours that maybe were a little bit slower, compensating and making that up through takeout and other means. So I think the bottom line here is people have to get creative. They need to talk to their personnel. They need to make sure people are happy to retain them, and to not have them be attracted to a business who's offering more what the employees are looking for.
And I think wrapping this whole thing up, I mean, the key thing that we just kept coming back to, whether it was a mistake or whether it's opportunity, it all comes around planning, and not planning in sort of, here's my vision, but planning in, here's what it's going to take step by step to get there, and taking into account every area of that business. The other thing I would say real quick is that this doesn't mean standard operating procedures, right? This doesn't mean plotting exactly how you're going to do everything. It's, if we do this, it's going to impact things over here. What is our plan for over here? And if we do that over here, how does that affect each of these plans? So the more detailed you get with plans and laying it out, the more proactive you can be, with a little bit of certitude that you've at least taken into account those things that may or may not impact your ability to make it work.
Well said. Thanks, everybody, for joining us for another edition of Reigniting Small Business. And we'll be back next week with another exciting episode.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.